So good morning. I'm Naylor, Professor of Earth System Science and Senior Fellow at the Center on Food Security and the Environment. And we're here today to talk with Professor Chris Barrett, who is a Professor of Applied Economics at Cornell University. Chris, you've been at Cornell for 21 years, and we're very happy to have you here. In fact, we wish we could keep you here. So that's our goal on,
Well,
on this interview. So today, Chris is going to be talking about innovations that are needed to solve some of the global food security challenges. And this is a highly relevant topic, but I thought I'd start by asking you what motivated you to get into this field of innovation, and how are you coming into this talk?
So I got into the field of innovation, although I don't consider myself an expert on innovation by any stretch. But I've gotten into the field of innovation because human progress really depends upon innovation. I mean, we're in a system that has very finite boundaries on the resources available to us. So if we want people to enjoy improving standards of living, and most of us want improving standards of living, if not for ourselves, at least for our children and grandchildren, then we need to be able to use those resources more efficiently and more creatively. That requires innovation. And this is perhaps especially true if you're concerned about social justice questions. We often think of innovations as being kind of the latest high-tech gizmo that upper or middle-income people are using, but arguably innovation is even more important for the world's poor. Because unless you imagine a very unusual world in which the poor suddenly gain the power to be able to secure resources to which they don't presently have access, we have to figure out how to use the limited resources to which they do have access much more productively so that they can enjoy improved standards of living for them and their children. That's where the real returns come. So innovation that is focused on reducing unnecessary human suffering is really one of the centerpieces of what my research program is about today.
Okay, that's excellent. And you're here talking about innovation in the Silicon Valley. So I think you have a large audience today that are really anxious to hear about this. And this progressive nature of innovation, I think, is a really important theme that's going to run through your talk.
That's right.
Can you just lay out what are the challenges we're trying to solve in global food security?
Absolutely. And let me first pick up the point you made about progressiveness. I try to emphasize this very heavily because we're talking about progress in two different senses of the word. One is technological progress, advancing, hence innovation. But the other is distributional progressivity, that we have a preferential option for the poor, if you will, that we should be trying to prioritize the needs of people who suffer unnecessarily over needs of those of us who are comfortable. Those are mainly wants, not needs. So that's this essence of progressive innovation, that we need to focus on the science and the technology that is absolutely essential to progress. We often find people who are very concerned about the well-being of the poor having some reticence about kind of modern advances in science. I have exactly the opposite opinion. I think science is an absolutely central pursuit if we really care about improving conditions for less fortunate populations. But we have to be paying attention all the time to who's going to benefit, because it's too easy for the gains to just accrue to those of us who are already rather well off. So then the next question becomes, why food security? There are multiple answers to that question. Depends upon what one's priorities, what one's values are. I come at this primarily from a social justice perspective. The human right to food is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, agreed in 1948 by virtually every nation on earth. So we understand that having adequate access to a healthy diet at all times for all peoples is a fundamental human right. I think that's enough personally, but that said, I accept that not everybody thinks these things are of paramount importance. There are other reasons. One, we've seen very clear evidence over the last decade in particular that food security is essential to socio-political stability. As we start to have greater stress over people's access to food, we have higher incidence of violence. I edited a book in 2013 that compiles a bunch of studies on precisely that topic, pointing pretty clearly to food security as being a major driver of instability around the world. So if you just care about reduced violence, lower probability of conflict, national security, then you should care about food security. Finally, there are environmental concerns, as you and your colleagues here at the Center on Food Security and the Environment know better than I do in many ways. Food is both a tremendous opportunity, the agri-food system is a tremendous opportunity to reduce environmental stress because it is a major source of environmental stress, perhaps especially on water, but also on climate, on soils, pressures on habitat that affect biodiversity, you name it. The agri-food sector has a huge footprint on the planet, and as we all become much more attuned to the real threat of anthropogenic changes to our natural environment, then we naturally need to look at the agri-food system and thus at food security pursuits. So for any of three reasons, to me, social justice comes first, but also kind of geopolitics and also environmental concerns. We should be careful about food security.
Yeah, so when I think of food security, I think one is just getting calories out there to everybody. So you want to innovate around staple crops. Another is nutrition, and so innovate around a much broader set of crops and potentially animal sources of protein and micronutrients. And then we have the obesity question that's even plagues poor people in households in the United States and in less developed countries. And so I assume you're innovating around all of these different topics as we're looking at food security.
That's right, although I would emphasize that the challenges we face in the global food security domain have evolved over time. 50 years ago, we faced very similar problems. If one can roll back one's memory, or for viewers who are too young to have any memory of 50 years ago, if you can just go look it up. Back in the late 60s, early 70s, there were widespread concerns about the population bomb, as your Stanford colleague Paul Ehrlich termed it in a very celebrated book. Population growth was quite rapid. There were recurring famines in much of the world, especially in Asia. That was perceived as feeding into the rollout of communism across many countries that suffered unrest. And so for both geopolitical containment purposes, for humanitarian purposes, there was a deep concern that we needed to increase the pile of rice, was the term often used. We needed to grow staple food supplies, basic cereals, roots, and tubers, so rice, wheat, maize, potatoes, sweet potatoes, etc. We needed to boost the productivity of those crops so as to ensure that food supply would keep pace with population growth and avert some of the geopolitical problems associated with serious stress. But the perception was this was very much a supply side problem. So the interventions needed to be around boosting supply, and it needed to be around staple commodities. That was the perception 50 years ago. And there's a lot to be said for that perception of the problem at that moment in time. It's important to keep in mind the world was phenomenally successful at meeting the goal of growing the pile of rice, loosely speaking, growing the calorie availability per person, despite the fact that global populations have roughly doubled during that time, a little more than doubled actually. We've increased by about 5 billion people over the last 50 years the number of folks who consume adequate calories any given day. So this is fabulous. On average, on an annual basis for 50 years, we've had about 90 million additional people eating adequate amounts of dietary energy any given day. By any standard, this is success, and that helped contribute to a doubling of the number of people who are out of poverty in the world in the last 25 years. It's had huge economic effects. It also helped to safeguard the environment by reducing the expansion of the agricultural frontier so you could preserve forests and wetlands and other fragile environmental spaces. So by any measure, that succeeded. Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Peace Prize 50 years ago in 1970 as a wheat breeder, largely for his contributions to that movement. But the challenges today are different. As you observe, obesity, a problem people didn't worry about 50 years ago, is a widespread problem. Roughly 80% of the world's obese people live in low and middle income countries. We think of it as being overweight as being a problem that affects only the rich, but in fact it is predominantly a problem of poor communities now. Micronutrient deficiencies, not enough minerals and vitamins in one's diet, are the most pervasive form of malnutrition. We don't even know how many people, almost certainly at least 2.5 billion people worldwide don't get enough zinc or iron or vitamin B12 or what have you. Some of these things we have relatively simple fixes for now. For example, iodizing salt is a very low cost, very effective way of ensuring people take in enough iodine to prevent goiter and other problems, especially cognitive performance problems associated with iodine deficiency. We have solutions, but we've not focused on these things. So the trick we face today is to change our orientation away from the we must grow the calorie supply orientation we had 50 years ago, which was very targeted towards staple crops, cereals in particular, shift that focus towards broader malnutrition and prioritizing micronutrient deficiencies and overweight and obesity, which are the prevailing problems today and are only going to become more important in the future. So shifting the focus as we try to adjust our strategies of innovation is really the key looking forward.
Yeah, so this is fascinating because what you've described is going from a supply side orientation. Now we're thinking of the demand for a much richer diet and a much more healthy diet and sustainable diet. But we also have to have an affordable diet, obviously,
Right.
for maybe the half the world's population, I think, lives under $2 a day, roughly. So the innovation needs to work on the supply side, but it also has to bring the price point down so that poor households can also afford these types of food.
That's right.
So let's dig into some of your innovation concepts.
Okay.
You have one concept of de-risking agriculture, and I love that term. And if you could just talk about de-risking agriculture in this context, that would be.
Sure. So it's important to keep in mind that most of the world's extreme poor work in agriculture. They are either farmers, small farmers, or they're farm workers. Many of the rest work in the agri-food system writ large. They work in transport, in processing, in storage. They work in food service. In this country, an awful lot of the working poor are working in the food service sector. They're in restaurants and working in kitchens or in fast food joints, what have you. So what is happening in the agri-food sector directly affects the incomes of the poor, which are already low, but they're also volatile. So climate change is one of the big threats facing farmers and farm workers. We see in many parts of the world, especially poorer parts of the world, the incidence and severity of drought is increasing, as is the incidence and severity of flooding. These things directly impact agricultural productivity, on-farm employment and labor productivity. So as we can de-risk some of the agricultural production system, whether that is through new supply-side technologies, things like drought-resistant maize, flood-resistant rice, things that can better withstand some of these greater climate shocks, we can stabilize the incomes of the poor. And by doing that, we can also encourage them to invest more. Because one of the things we know from the economics of poverty traps is that risk exposure induces people to pursue conservative strategies. We all think about what's the worst possible outcome for our family, and we consciously or unconsciously take steps to avoid catastrophic outcomes. Many of the steps we take to avoid catastrophic outcomes are to avoid things that offer us considerable upside potential. So we see routinely that the poor use low return, low risk portfolios of strategies to earn income. Since they depend disproportionately on the agri-food system for their incomes, de-risking agriculture by making it more adapted to more severe climates and more volatile climates, but also to the changing range of pests and pathogens. Climate change is changing the basic ecology, not just of primary production in farmers' fields, but also to the pathogens that enter the food stream after food is evacuated from a field and goes through the supply chain to reach people's homes. We see this in outbreaks of various foodborne disease, for example. Right now, we're witnessing a different infectious disease, coronavirus or COVID-19, that is also causing serious disruptions, including to food supply chains. An awful lot of food supply chains work through China, and the necessary controls to try to slow the transmission of this disease are now interrupting food flows. So how do we ensure a healthy, timely, low-cost food supply for people who need it in a world that's growing riskier by the year? Trade wars obviously don't help here either, in that they introduce all kinds of uncertainty into markets. But that exposure to risk is really important. So there are a variety of things one can do about this. Governments can employ safety nets, reliable, ready-to-go safety nets. The government of India launched the world's largest safety net a little more than a decade ago, about 15 years ago, with the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Under the Constitution of India, an act in the 1990s, guaranteed everyone the right to 100 days of paid employment by the government at a low wage rate, Nobody wants to have to go do that, but much like the Public Works Administration during the Great Depression here in the United States in the 1930s, this gives people a guarantee that if things go really badly, there is work for you. There is going to be a paycheck. It might not be at the level you want it to be, but that gives you some assurance you can take care of the basic necessities for your family. There's a fair literature now demonstrating the positive effects of that employment guarantee scheme on a range of different indicators for the poor in India. And there are similar sorts of safety nets around the world, but they've really only just been emerging and spreading over the past generation. And we need to be scaling out those sorts of public safety net programs. There are also lots of privately provided mechanisms we can use. Many of them work on basic principles of insurance. My group has worked with partners in East Africa and some other academics here in the US to develop something called index-based livestock insurance, which is intended to serve the needs of some of the poorest pastoralist populations in East Africa, folks who are living in very dry lands where they can't reliably cultivate crops. There is really no industrial employment, so they rely upon extensive grazing of cattle and camels and goats across landscapes. But droughts hit and commonly kill off 40 to 70% of herds. That's a catastrophic shock that literally kills people. So how can you take that risk that's very localized in a particular geography and move it out of there so as to protect those people against these drought shocks, especially if they're growing more frequent? Well, you can use financial instruments. So we use satellite measures of rangeland vegetation to be able to write an insurance contract where people get paid based off of a sufficiently low observation from the satellites of vegetation on the rangelands, because that's very strongly associated with the probability of herd mortality. And by doing that, we can get insurance companies to sell this product to these pastoralists. So individuals pay to insure themselves against catastrophic loss. Those funds go to a reinsurance company, in this case in Europe, and that risk is thereby moved, drought risk is moved from the Horn of Africa into global capital markets. Droughts hit, payments come from global capital markets, from these reinsurers, through local underwriters, back out to the pastoralists. We've carefully evaluated these programs, and they generate an extremely high benefit cost ratio. And the crucial thing is they are really helping to stabilize people's assurance of income so that they feel less stress around the risk that they're running. When things happen, they're less likely to, for example, reduce consumption, food consumption for their family. They're less likely to engage in distressed sale of their surviving livestock, which only compromises their future. So these sorts of tools can be used in commercial settings. You don't have to have only public sector safety nets. You can also use commercial devices like insurance products. You can do this through the procurement channels. Companies can offer multi-year guarantees. There aren't hedging instruments available to small farmers in most of the world, but companies that are buying up large amounts of commodities can effectively introduce hedging through, for example, multi-year guarantees on contracts, through prepayment of contracts for commodities they know they'll be buying so as to eliminate some of the price risk people face. So de-risking is very feasible. It's just not widely adopted yet. And we need to kind of accelerate the promotion of de-risking in a world that's growing riskier.
Yeah, it's really well explained, because there's obviously incentives for the public sector, for governments to get in the business, especially if widespread unemployment or widespread hunger leads to instability in their governments.
Exactly.
China just cares mostly about political stability and governance, as does India, obviously. Right. But the private sector mechanisms you're talking about are showing really high private returns to these investments, and I think actually engaging private sector capital markets and private sector companies in this process globally is fascinating. I mean, the global insurance industry is what, a $5 trillion industry or something, and getting that to reach really the poor is a fascinating concept. So it's great that there are incentives on both sides, and it doesn't always have to be on the government side. So when we think about some of these mechanisms, if you were to think about you're in Silicon Valley now, and you want to get some of the capital that is going into a lot of things like apps for your cell phone and this and that. How do we get some of the innovation capital to the issues that are most pressing in the world? If I go to Nairobi or to Accra, I see entrepreneurs really investing in water supplies, food supplies, communication channels, and so forth. And here we seem to be more or less, focused on things that can earn a high return to make us a billionaire. How do we balance out that capital? What would your pitch be to an audience here in the Silicon Valley that says, bring your money to Africa, to the pastoralist?
Well, I think there are two different messages to be promoted. And first, it's important to recognize that I've never successfully pitched in Silicon Valley, so take this with a grain of salt. But the first is that there is money to be made. I mean, there's a really basic principle. When people have problems that you can solve, they're willing to pay you to solve those problems. So as long as you can come up with a reliable and reasonably low-cost method compared to their willingness to pay, you can make money off of solving people's problems. And that's exactly what an awful lot of very successful, especially Asian and African businesses are doing now. Our media is full of horror stories of unfortunate things happening in Asia and Africa, but the underlying stories are largely positive in most of those continents in my experience. I've spent a lot of time in the developing world, and everywhere you turn, you're seeing successful businesses getting started, people making a lot of money, often, not always, but often, by solving other people's problems. So, for example, you tell stories of digital technologies. Apps are hugely popular here. Well, the banking system in Kenya has been completely overhauled by a very simple app on a cell phone. Now, most of the funds that transfer in Kenya are mediated not through conventional banking systems, but through apps that are much more widely used for transactions, in particular the M-Pesa platform, much more commonly used than Americans use banking apps. I mean, we've got an app that has very successfully fed financial flows that stabilize people when they suffer risks, that help women shield their earnings from their husbands in settings where they might be subject to some abuse. So there's a fair amount of evidence now that that is really contributing to people exiting poverty in Kenya and disproportionately helping female-headed households and women to enjoy improved levels of standards of living and their children to do so as well. So there are profit-seeking opportunities. That's an entirely private platform. There wasn't a single dollar of public money that went into creating M-Pesa. And the founders of it and the company that runs the platform have become fabulously rich as a result of it. You can do this. So there's money to be made by solving people's problems. But I'd also like to think, in my observation as a professor in a business school, the Dyson School at Cornell, which is my primary unit at Cornell, is the undergraduate business school. Our motto is, "Our business is a better world." And I observe that today's most talented undergraduates in business, and an awful lot of MBA students too, they want more than just to make money. They care about what they're doing, and does it make meaning in the world? Are they helping to solve problems? They're much more attuned to environmental and social justice issues than our generation was. And so most investors should be looking for, how do I do something good for the world? And if you still want to be purely self-interested about it, although I fervently believe most people care about more than just themselves and their own bank account, but if you want to be purely self-interested, this matters to your HR strategy. If you're a company that really wants to recruit the best and the brightest and to retain them, then you need to appeal to those talented young people's aspiration that they not only make a good salary, but they make a difference. And ultimately, every successful business based on innovation depends on the talent, the skill set, the drive of its staff. So the secret to being a really successful innovator is not just having a great idea on blueprints or being able to raise money from VCs. It's being able to attract and keep the best talent. And you have to be able to pay them, so you have to have something that makes money, but you also have to be able to motivate them. And that's where solving real people's problems, so people feel excited about what they're doing. They're proud to go tell their grandmother what they're doing, 7 days a week or 6 days a week. That's a really strong motivator for them.
Yeah, and we certainly see that at Stanford, at the business
Yes.
school here as well, because I think around half of the business school students are from overseas, various countries, but even those that are from the United States have really strong interest to have a purpose, to make a difference and so forth.
That's
So
right.
they're very excited to have
That's
you on
right.
campus, by the way. I know you've been talking to a lot of them. But, you know, as I think about what kind of a difference that they will make and what Silicon Valley and other innovators can make, it goes much beyond just what's happening in the field or with the actual livestock producers. You talked about the whole supply chain where many people work in food companies and food services and implements that go into producing food and so forth. So one of your concepts in your talk is the de-agrarianization of innovation. So can you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, de-agrarianization is not only a mouthful of a word, but it's a relatively straightforward concept. Agrarian meaning land, and de-agrarianization means to increasingly decouple our food system from the land on which we historically have grown all of our domesticated crops and livestock. So why would this be? Well, there are two basic pressures here. The first is just the natural tendency of all of us as consumers. As our incomes grow, we consume more food, but our expenditures are increasingly not on the nutrient content, the physical food. It's on all of the processing, all of the presentation, all of the service that goes around it. As a result, we see that in the United States, for example, of every dollar consumers spend on food, only about 14 cents of it goes back to farmers. About 86 cents on the food dollar spent by consumers accrues to those who operate in the channel between the farm gate and my dining table or the restaurant table where I might sit to eat. So most of the food dollar is actually post-farm gate. Our food is already heavily de-agrarianized. And by the way, this isn't just in a rich country, in the United States. Some colleagues at USDA and Cornell and I are finishing up some work where we find that across about 90% of the world's economy, for which we have good data and can generate these comparable statistics, the average is that more than 70% of the consumer food dollar is accruing post-farm gate. It's accruing to those in the supply chain. So the de-agrarianization of the food system is partly a natural consequence of consumers' growing demand for things other than the feedstock that was grown on a farm. So that's the first part to recognize. And that means that an awful lot of the solutions to food-related problems, whether those are environmental problems, health problems like obesity attributable in part to ultra-processed food, many of those solutions exist in the post-farm gate portion of the supply chain. So we need to pay attention to the non-agrarian part. The second part of de-agrarianization is, I think, the more innovative and powerful part, and that is that just as a century ago, we began to very aggressively substitute capital for labor in agricultural production. The reaper, variety of mechanized implements for harvesting, processing, storing, herbicides to replace weeding labor, all of these forms of capital began to replace labor in the production of agricultural feedstocks for our food system because the value of labor was growing very high. And so the opportunity cost of labor on farm being higher as industry grew meant we had to substitute for labor. Capital did that effectively. In the 21st century, as we appreciate the value of land for a whole host of largely environmental reasons beyond just producing food, land that doesn't have great alternative uses in industry or providing services, does have great opportunities for generating solar energy, for capturing wind through turbines, for sequestering carbon in the soils, for capturing methane that comes off of a manure lagoon associated with a livestock operation. And all of these other uses now have very high value, but somewhat displace our ability to produce agricultural feedstock for the food system. We are able to make that transition so that people can move from farming just cattle and row crops like soybeans and corn to farming carbon and methane and solar and wind energy if we begin to develop the technologies to produce substitute proteins, especially, off the farm, decoupled from the land through capital. And there are some really exciting ventures right now that are doing that. I mean, many people now are having Impossible Burgers through Burger King or White Castle, or they're getting Beyond Meat products at Dunkin' Donuts or some other place. And there are a whole host of cellular meat alternative operations emerging. The technology to develop the proteins that go into our fundamental foods is progressing fast enough that we can see the cost points coming to the stage that we are going to have to make some very conscious and thoughtful decisions around the transition of farmlands. Either the alternatives from cellular and plant-based protein substitutes will cause the marginal cost of ingredients in food manufacturing, products like casein that goes into a lot of food products that comes from dairy. If you can produce it a lot cheaper in a laboratory with a fermenter than you can on a farm, food manufacturers are going to get the low-cost source. And that's going to undercut a revenue stream for dairy producers. The value of dairy farms will fall. We'll have an accelerating rate of closure of dairy farms and consolidation of the sector. So if we just let this happen in an unmanaged fashion, we're going to start to see a collapse of rural farmland values. We'll see defaults in the banking systems that are heavily reliant upon agricultural lending or agriculture-related lending, to input suppliers, not just to farms. And we'll see an intensification of the rural poverty that already exists in this country and around the world. The alternative is that we invest the massive amounts we in the US and the rest of the world spend supporting farmers for a variety of reasons. We spend about $700 billion a year, about $1 million a minute globally is spent on farm support payments. So why not be using some of that to help to subsidize the value of procurement of solar panels, to help farmers to put in a biodigester to generate methane. If they're going to continue on their farm, they can capture methane to generate electricity to sell into the grid to supplement their earnings from milk. You have to help them to convert to a new strategy of farming as the inevitable conversion of substituting capital for land begins, much like a century ago, the conversion of capital, the substitution of capital for labor started. We're seeing that emerging now. We're just not preparing and redesigning policy to handle it very effectively.
So if we look out, we're at 2020 now. If we look out 10 years, 2030, what share of the animal protein that we're eating do you think will be out of these plant-based or other cellular forms as opposed to actually from an animal?
It depends radically on what types of proteins you're talking about. For those who enjoy a thick T-bone steak, virtually none of it is going to be coming from other sources because it's a fairly complicated operation. I mean, the technology of getting to the point of replicating the sensory feel of lots of different types of animal meat or animal products is very difficult to replicate right now. Might we get there? Yeah, but that's not going to be happening fast. But the crucial thing to recognize, again, going back to that first part of de-agrarianization, most of the food we're eating is going through processing. And an awful lot of processing involves products that consumers just are not aware of. Don't pay attention to what's on that long laundry list of ingredients on the back portion of a package. And I would expect that in another decade, the vast majority of the currently animal-sourced foods, ingredients that are in our processed products will have converted to be de-agrarianized. They'll be derived in this country and other more technologically sophisticated countries. They'll be derived primarily from a lab-based process. We've already seen this conversion happen, by the way. So if anybody eats cheese in this country, you have already gone through that experience, because it used to be that the cheese in the United States was made using rennet processed from young cows, from calves. Well, animal rights movements, as well as the rapid growing demand for cheese, which simply outstripped our ranchers' ability to raise and slaughter young calves for veal and to harvest rennet from their organs, compelled processors to find an alternative method. So rennet today is a genetically engineered bacterium. It's all produced in a lab. And more than 90% of the cheese supply in the United States has now been completely decoupled from livestock agriculture, where your grandparents, everything they ate in the way of cheese had rennet. We've done this, same thing in insulin production. So the trick there is whether it is an ingredient or it is the final product. For final product, substitution's going to exist, but it's going to be at limited scale, especially over the coming 10 or 20 years. But for ingredients that go into processed product, it's going to be a very rapid transition. And that's going to make all the difference at the margin to producers, because ranchers are not growing cattle just for T-bone steaks. They need all the other byproducts, all the revenue streams that come from all the different pieces of the cow that they can sell off. And as some of that begins to diminish in its profitability or is no longer profitable at all, you lose money trying to sell some products into the industrial processing chain. That undercuts the value of the farming activity, hence the need for substitute sources of revenue. And we can turn farming from being actually a climate burden as it is presently, about a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions globally are attributable to agricultural production. We could turn it into a climate solution. You can turn farms into carbon sinks. You can turn them into sources of energy that displace our need for fossil fuels that wind up actually seriously damaging the climate. So accelerating that conversion is the twin to accelerating the development of these alternatives to livestock-based proteins. Yeah. We can't do, the latter is already underway, especially here in Silicon Valley. There's a huge amount of activity, much of it very exciting. Many of them will fail, but some are going to succeed fabulously. Some already have. But if that progresses without a companion, how do we help the farming sector that presently has a lot of essentially stranded assets in farmland and livestock and row crops that feed those livestock? How do we help them to transition so that they can enjoy some of the gains society stands to reap from these technological advances and alternatives to livestock-based proteins? We will have real problems as a society. We'll not only have failed these presently rural communities that have been a bedrock for not just the United States, but all over the world. I mean, the farming communities have been incredibly important culturally as well as economically and nutritionally. But we'll have also failed to take advantage of an opportunity to help solve our collective climate problems and environmental problems. So this de-agrarianization is a tremendous opportunity for us. It's not clear people are paying attention closely enough yet to accelerate the transition at the pace we need.
Yeah. This is, as you're talking, I'm thinking about all of these innovations are driven by really a new sense of nutrition and nutritional and healthy diets. It's also driven by people's acute awareness of environmental problems, including the climate problem, and wanting to move towards more sustainable kinds of foods. And as I think about the demand and the future of demand, I can't help but think geographically, like Africa is going to add, the bulk of the additional population during the course of this century. So there's new loci of demands as well. But as we think about, you said people aren't paying enough attention. If you had an audience, and we'll kind of wrap up here with this question, if you had an audience to talk to about this and give one message, would it be governments? Are they the ones that are actually constraining the innovation or helping the innovation? Is it just education and people's knowledge of what's needed? Who is the best audience to really get your message across to?
Unfortunately, there isn't a single best audience because this is very much a team effort. The food system is fundamentally private. Yeah. So producers at farm level are private. Producers now increasingly off-farm in laboratories are private. The food processors and wholesalers and retailers and food service firms are private. The idea that the food system, the agri-food system, can be driven by the public sector is a fantasy. We have to engage business. Yeah. We absolutely have to engage business. But business operates within an environment set by cultural norms and set by policies and laws. Some of the ones that really need some careful thinking include intellectual property. We've seen a dramatic change in intellectual property around living organisms during our lifetimes. That has significant consequences for the agri-food system. As we see newly emergent technologies, we need to think hard about Are the gains from those technologies going to be captured entirely by private investors, or will those dissipate globally? One of the lessons of the prior Green Revolution era of successfully addressing a massive global food security challenge was that large-scale investment through governments and through philanthropies in open access, we would call it now, in publicly accessible intellectual property, new genetic material that was not held under patent protection and had to be licensed for cash, but that was made freely available, that accounted for a great deal of the productivity gain and the widespread distribution of the benefits from technological progress in the agri-food system in a prior generation. It's not clear to me that our emergent intellectual property regimes are equally well positioned to ensure that the technologies that are on the way now, that we'll see emerge over the coming generation, are going to similarly enjoy widespread participation and benefit. So IP is a big thing. Trade is enormously important, as we're seeing now.
Yes.
The trade wars of the last couple of years have caused very serious disruptions, both in farming communities, but also in the agri-food processing industries, and they're having implications for consumers. We need to all be in this together, especially in a world in which climate shocks are increasingly creating pretty serious disruptions in one or another place that are balanced out someplace else on the earth. There is some breadbasket that is enjoying a windfall year at the same time as another place is having a very difficult year. Trade is the way in which we cushion ourselves. It's our collective insurance policy. So trade policies, I think of as enormously important to helping to absorb the shocks that are increasing in the world. And finally, it's these safety nets. Ultimately, the opening sentences of Amartya Sen's classic book, Poverty and Famines. Amartya Sen won the Nobel Prize, not exclusively, but in large part for that absolutely path-breaking book. The opening sentences of that book, and I'll butcher it a little bit, but to paraphrase, he says something on the order of, hunger is not the phenomenon of there not being enough food to eat. Hunger is the phenomenon of people not having enough food to eat. The emphasis being that it's not purely a supply-side problem. It's a matter of people having the entitlements, having the legal right and the resources to be able to ensure their families are adequately nourished. If we fail to meet this standard, enshrined in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we're going to fail in the challenge of achieving global food security. So the food system, the agri-food system, is fundamentally private. Businesses have to be a part of it, and I include there the financial system that mediates the investment and insurance operations of all private sector actors. But governments play a crucial role in setting the rules of the game on things like intellectual property and trade, and ensuring there's adequate public investment, supporting educational infrastructure. Great universities like Stanford or Cornell are a really important part of this, but also in making sure that people who do fall through the cracks, because there always will be lots of them, that they've got some recourse. If they have that recourse, we truly can have a food secure world, and in doing so, we can advance human flourishing more broadly and protect the planet. That should be our aspiration.
Well, that's just a great note to end on. I love just your positive look at this, and I think that's why you're so successful in this field, is that you not only have a positive outlook, but you've taken it to real action. I think you've given a lot of really specific points where students and other community members here at Stanford can go out and actually engage with you in this effort. So thank you so much,
Well,
and
thank you very
I'm sure
much.
everyone will love your talk as well.
Thank you, Roz. Pleasure.
Bye.
Thanks.